Last week on the program, we spoke to a miner in Kentucky. He and his colleagues hadn't been paid for their last several weeks of work at a company called Black Jewel. And it turns out that there is a long and what sounds like pretty systematic a pattern of exploitation of miners and other folks with pensions in Kentucky and, of course, around the world by investors of various kinds, private equity companies, and so on. And my next guest is here to shed a little bit more light on what's going on with pensions in Kentucky, with perhaps the Black Jewel story as well. Chris Tobe is an investment analyst and financial advisor. He's an expert in public pensions and in problems with public pensions. He's exposed a lot of bad actors, I would say, in that area. He's the author of 4 books, including one called Kentucky Fried Pensions, and he joins us now. So first of all, Chris Tobe, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. And let's start with, last week I was talking, I want to get to the pensions, but before we get to the pensions, let's start with the Black Jewel story. So, okay, we had Josh Holbrook, miner, on last week, talking about how they had stopped a train on its tracks because their employer, Black Jewel Mining Company, had gone out of business, not paid them, so they are owed money by the company. They're not getting it. And so they stopped a train with $1 million worth of coal on it. And I asked Josh Holbrook the question, did the miners know who actually arranged for the shipment of this coal? Because somebody's going to get that $1 million or however much it's worth. And he wasn't they didn't have that information or any insight. We always look, like the prosecutors, cui bono, right? Who benefits off of this? So you might have some thoughts about that, right?
Yeah, again, I've been involved in this private equity things on both sides, on the kind of the pension side, and then on what these private equity managers have done by killing jobs for coal miners and retailers around the country. So what I noticed in Kentucky, everyone in Kentucky is making a big political deal out of the miners. It is in Kentucky, but they forget that the person in front of them in line for money happens to be a private equity firm called Riverstone, associated with the Carlyle Group, that is actually partially owned or partially funded by the Kentucky Teachers Retirement System. And there's a complete disconnect that these teachers are all supporting the miners, but their money is actually going for a private equity firm that is in front of the miners taking their money. So there's this implicit contradiction because of the lack of knowledge, the lack of transparency of pensions and private equity finances in general that causes a lot of destruction of jobs in this country.
I think it's such an important point, Chris, and I think that as we, I've done a little writing in this area, and as some of us know, but as a lot of us, I'd say most of us don't know, there is this sort of separate world that takes place of private equity investment that acts against the public interest, but that has a lot of institutional investors, not just, people think of billionaires or whatever putting their money into these funds, and they do, but sometimes, but the institutional investors might be public employees' pension fund, might be a miner's pension fund, might be, like you say, in this case, teacher's pension fund, and people don't realize that all the forces at play here, and maybe even if they did, they might be able to do something about it.
Yeah, and again, that's one of the things I'm trying to bring some awareness in Kentucky. It's not only, of course, public pensions, it's also universities, their endowments. They are the heaviest investors in private equity, have been universities. And people, don't even know what private equity goes by a lot of other terms, venture capital. We all know about, the Gordon Gekko in Wall Street was kind of the epitome of that type of corporate greed. We've got Wilbur Ross now as Commerce Secretary. We had, of course, Mitt Romney at the Bain, that people have started to become familiar with some of these private equity actors, but they all are just symbols of greed throughout our country.
You know, it's very important for people to understand this. For example, you know, Mitt Romney, Bain Capital really got started as a spinoff of Bain Consulting by getting a special deal from the state of Massachusetts to acquire companies. They thought it would lead to the creation of jobs. They became a job killing organization. And so there's this big force in public life that invests a lot of times in socially detrimental ways. Nobody really follows that story. And they don't just invest in a startup corporation or whatever. They might buy the debt of distressed companies or even of distressed governments like that of Puerto Rico, and then use their political influence to get outcomes that are good for them and bad for the people. And I have a sense that maybe that's what happened in a small way, you know, relative to the state of what should be the state of Puerto Rico, but that what happened with my friend Josh and the miners in Cumberland, Kentucky, is a similar state. I suspect that, but you can tell me that that this investment firm associated with the Carlyle Group might have bought up the debt of Black Jewel and might be stacking the deck against the miners and in favor of themselves.
I mean, that's what it appears to be from what I can tell. These things are, you know, very complicated, but they have the first 24 million. They have the call on the first money as the debt, which is similar to what we've seen in Puerto Rico. There's some groups, hedge clippers out there that have done some good work on Puerto Rico as well. But the best private equity group, I guess, has been, you know, Toys R Us has been the biggest example of these retailers like Toys R Us. There's a few others that they've just destroyed the jobs just to suck out the underlying real estate. And then we have the hospitals now that Bernie Sanders, the one in Philadelphia, where the private equity firm is trying to close it down just to suck the underlying assets out of it.
Yeah, that would be Heinemann Hospital, I think, in Philadelphia. Yeah. And so, all right, and then, so that's the Black Jewel, you know, maybe, it could be the Black Jewel story. That's how these players operate. They're out for themselves. They're out to maximize returns any way they can. Sometimes institutional investors, like the ones you mentioned, jump into this. What about public pensions in Kentucky? I know this has been an issue of I know you look nationwide, but I think Kentucky public pensions have been a special interest area to you for a while. How do public employees get mixed up in this world of private equity?
Well, it's been building gradually over the years. But one of the things that people don't realize that it has exploded in the last 7 or 8 years since the Citizens United decision. Citizens United allows unlimited political donations to super PACs, and these I believe it's hard to prove that these private equity and hedge funds have been showing a lot of money to all these state level, you know, governors and treasurers and so on, legislator super PACs all over the country to get more private equity business in these pensions, because these politicians indirectly control most of these public pension boards. So I think it's a huge pay-to-play type of thing in the public pensions with private equity that's just exploded since Citizens United. Well, and that's not just Kentucky, that's everywhere.
So tell me and tell our audience briefly how that works. How does it come to be? I think most people assume, or a lot of people assume, that their pensions, especially if they're a public employee, are controlled by the union, and that there's at least some level of distance between that and the elected officials. But tell me how you think that network of influence might work.
I don't think very few. I mean, I think that's been the conservative media has made up that thing that unions control pensions. I think that's just a pure lie. There's very few public pensions that are really run by unions. The main public pension lawyers, there are a few maybe teachers out there, but the vast majority are, have a lot of control of politicians. And then there also could be union-controlled super PACs and things as well. I mean, there's some corruption there, but mostly the conservatives have been controlling the agenda on public pensions and have really been blaming everything on unions, whereas these private equity guys, I think, are much more to blame, pulling the strings behind the scenes. Just in Kentucky alone, I think that they're paying out $300 million a year to these Wall Street guys in fees and secret no-bid contracts, many of them in offshore type arrangements. And that just, to me, doesn't seem like to be good government. Secret no-bid contracts at first, and that amount of money. At that amount of money, at $300 million, they can afford to kick back, a few million here and there. And especially in Kentucky, it doesn't take much to influence politicians.
No, it certainly doesn't. And, I was just thinking as we were talking also, maybe the biggest such example, and one of the biggest would be, and I don't know if you've looked at it closely, but out in California, you have the CalSTRS system, and that, I believe, is some of the retirement board is made up of the governor's appointees, and there have been all sorts of conflicts and stories about CalSTRS. In Kentucky, as you're saying, $300 million is real money, no big contracts. Can people see those contracts?
No, it was, I was a trustee for 4 years. I wasn't even allowed to see the contracts. The state auditor wasn't allowed to see them. The legislative contract review committee wasn't allowed to see them. There's been some laws that we've tried to change that in Kentucky. No one's enforcing them, but they are considered to be very secretive. And the reason they have to be secret is because if they were public, people would see that they break most state fiduciary laws. And because they allow the private equity people to charge all kinds of excessive fees to trade for themselves in front of the public pension and so on. So that's the reason they have to keep these contracts secret.
So the secret contracts, dark money in politics, clear conflicts of interest here, political decision makers who have every motivation in the world to play along. It's not a pretty picture you're painting here, Chris Tobe. Is there anybody, for example, in the state of Kentucky in the political system or even outside it as some kind of organizer, is there anybody, obviously you're trying to fight this, but are there any politicians trying to fight this? Are there any groups trying to fight this?
Very few groups. There's nobody really out there. There's a few state representatives who are allies of mine. Jim Wayne helped me write some of this legislation. He's now gone, but Lisa Wilner. So a few of the more progressive legislators in Kentucky have been helpful in this. A few media outlets have done some work. When David Sirota was active, he did some work on this. Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone. We've had a guy named Neil Weinberg at Bloomberg has done some work in this area, and we have a few decent local reporters in Kentucky. John Cheese, the Lexington Herald leader, Joe Sonka, now the Courier-Journal, who have done some work kind of trying to expose this. But they're few and far between, and they pretty much get ignored by the overall, just the weight of all this money is just overwhelms, I think, most of these state governments.
Yeah, it seems like it. So let me ask you this. What are your own personal plans for continuing to investigate this and speak about this?
I'm just going to keep trying to, go shows like this, get it exposed. And I think probably it's going to end up in litigation somehow. When you have such terribly funded pension plans like Kentucky, 13% funded, worst funded in the country, when things get real bad and politicians, want to find another finger to blame, eventually maybe there'll be some legal actions against some of these deeper pocket private equity and hedge funds that I think may eventually happen. And I do expert work for a living, involved in a couple things. Mostly I work in 401k excessive fees, but I think public pensions may eventually be an area where there'll be legal action may move the needle some on this.
Yeah, well, I certainly hope so. And last question for you, Chris Tobe. I understand that you recently ran for auditor of the state of Kentucky, and it seems to me you would be an ideal auditor for the state. How'd that work out?
Didn't work out very well. One of the problems is that our newspapers have kind of fallen. None of the major newspapers in our state endorsed in the race. I got the only competitive endorsement, which was a gay rights organization, Fairness, in the entire state. So there's so little endorsement that it all really comes down to a name recognition battle, which is who gets the most money. And an opponent who put in triple the money I did, and so I could not win, even though I had a lot of name recognition among people, in the know. But in general, when you have there's no media stepping up to endorse or do anything like that. No organizations really stepping up. It ends up turning into a popularity contest.
Yeah,
name recognition.
That's a shame, and I would imagine the big money did not go with you in that race. So unfortunately, it worked out the way it did. And auditor is a really important job. I want to see more states and more activists in states get involved in those types of runs. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But Chris Tobe, that's Tobe, Chris Tobe, people can find your work at www.christobe.com. Thanks for all your great work in this area, and thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you for having me.